3 days after I inherited my uncle's ranch, a stranger walked onto my porch, looked me in the eye, and said, "You owe the HOA $120,000. No warning, no explanation, just a deadline, and a threat to take my land." That's when I knew. They didn't pick the wrong ranch. They picked the wrong owner. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet in that way only rural places ever are. The sun had just cleared the tree line, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Birds were making more noise than people, which suited me just fine. I had a mug of black coffee in my hand, still hot, still steaming, and for the first time in years, I wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. I had only moved in 3 days earlier. 3 days. The ranch still smelled like my uncle, old wood, dust, and coffee that had been brewed the same way for decades. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, just solid, honest land that had been here long before anyone ever thought to slap a logo on it and call it a community. That's when I heard footsteps on the porch. I looked up, expecting maybe a delivery truck or a curious neighbor. Instead, there stood a man I had never seen before in my life. Mid-50s, red in the face, golf shirt tucked too neatly into khaki pants that didn't belong anywhere near a working ranch. He was holding a thick binder under his arm like it was a badge of authority. He didn't say hello, didn't ask my name, didn't even ask if I was the owner. He flipped open the binder, scanned a page, then looked straight at me and said, "You're the new owner of this property, correct?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I inherited it from my uncle." That's when he dropped it on me. "Well then," he said, tapping the binder with his finger, "you've inherited his unpaid HOA dues as well. 12 years of back payments, with penalties and interest. That comes to $120,000. I actually laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to accept what my ears had just heard. "I'm sorry," I said. "Did you just say HOA?" He nodded, already halfway to the next page. "Spring Valley Homeowners Association. This ranch falls under our jurisdiction." That was the moment the coffee almost slipped out of my hand. My uncle never mentioned an HOA, not once, and this was a man who would remind you if you owed him $20. I looked past the man, out over the land. Acres of open pasture, pine trees, a dirt road that hadn't been paved in my lifetime. No gates, no signs, no clubhouse, no swimming pool, no manicured lawns, nothing that even remotely resembled an HOA. "I don't think this property is part of any association," I said carefully. The man's jaw tightened. "According to our records," he replied, "it is. And if payment isn't received within 30 days, the HOA will have no choice but to place a lien on the property." There it was. The threat. He snapped the binder shut, handed me a single sheet of paper, then turned around and walked back toward a black SUV parked at the end of my driveway. On the door was a small decal I hadn't noticed before. Spring Valley HOA. He drove off without another word. I stood there on the porch long after the sound of his engine disappeared, the paper shaking slightly in my hand. The morning was still beautiful. The birds hadn't stopped singing. The land hadn't changed, but something else had. At that moment, I didn't know who that man really was. I didn't know he was the president of the entire HOA, and I definitely didn't know how far they were willing to go. All I knew was this: whatever he was trying to pull, it wasn't a mistake, and I wasn't about to hand over my uncle's land without a fight. After his SUV disappeared down the road, I stayed on that porch for a long time. I didn't move, didn't sit down, didn't even take another sip of my coffee. I just stood there, staring out at the land my uncle had left me, trying to understand how a place that felt this quiet could suddenly come with a threat attached to it. Because nothing about that ranch felt like it belonged to anyone else. To understand why that mattered so much to me, you need to know who I was before all this, and who my uncle was long before that man ever showed up with a binder and a bill. My name is Jack Carter. I'm 34 years old. Until recently, my life was about as ordinary as it gets. I taught high school science in Houston. I graded papers at night. I drank my coffee too strong and complained about traffic like everyone else. I wasn't rich. I wasn't powerful. I wasn't looking for a fight with anyone. Land disputes were something you read about in the newspaper, not something that happened to people like me. My Uncle Mike was my mother's older brother. He never married, never had kids. He lived alone and he liked it that way. He wasn't antisocial, just private. He believed a man didn't need much to be content, as long as he had land under his boots and quiet at the end of the day. When I was a kid, I spent my summers with him. He taught me how to ride a horse before I learned how to drive a car. He showed me how to mend a fence, how to read the weather, how to tell when the creek was going to rise just by the sound of it. He wasn't the kind of man who gave long speeches, but everything he taught me stuck because he lived it. That ranch was his life's work. He bought the land decades ago, back when it was cheap because no one wanted something so far from town. He built the barn himself, hauled timber, dug fence posts by hand. Every board on that property had a story behind it, even if only he remembered it. He used to tell me, "Land doesn't belong to people like you think. You belong to it. Your job is just to take care of it while you're here." When he passed away, I was stunned to learn he'd left the ranch to me. I hadn't expected anything. I would have been grateful just to keep visiting it once in a while. But there it was, spelled out in black and white. Carter's Edge, his words, not mine, was now my responsibility. So I quit my job, sold my small condo, packed everything I owned into a rented truck, and drove north with my dog riding shotgun. That first week on the ranch felt like stepping into another lifetime. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors looking over fences, just wind through the trees and the creak of the old farmhouse settling at night. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile from the road, framed by a simple wooden arch my uncle had built years ago. It read, "Carter's Edge." There were no gates, no guard shack, no sign-in board, no list of rules nailed to a post. No HOA welcome packet tucked under the door. And that mattered. Because if this place had been part of an HOA, there would have been signs. There always are. Someone would have told my uncle, someone would have told me. There would have been letters, meetings, notices. But there was nothing. Which made that man's claim feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain yet. Standing there on the porch, holding that paper, I tried to replay every conversation I'd ever had with my uncle. He'd told me about droughts, about bad winters, about developers who'd come sniffing around, offering checks with too many zeros. But he'd never once mentioned an HOA. And my uncle was many things, but forgetful wasn't one of them. That was when the first real thought crept in. Maybe this wasn't about unpaid dues at all. Maybe someone had been waiting for my uncle to be gone. I folded the paper slowly and slipped it into my pocket. The land around me hadn't changed. It was still mine. Still quiet. Still honest. But I had the distinct feeling that I'd just stepped into a fight I didn't ask for, and one my uncle had already survived once before, and I was about to find out why. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that binder. The way it rested on his arm like a badge. The way his voice never rose, never rushed, as if the outcome had already been decided, and my role was simply to sign and comply. By morning, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt observed. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper he'd handed me. At the top was a logo that looked clean and modern, too clean for a place that smelled like pine, dust, and old wood. Spring Valley Homeowners Association. Below it was a breakdown of numbers that made my stomach tighten. Annual dues, late fees, penalties, interest, all carefully stacked until they reached the same impossible total, $120,000. At the bottom, in bold letters, was a sentence that didn't ask for anything. Payment due within 30 days to avoid further enforcement action. That word, enforcement, sat heavy in my chest. If this was a mistake, it would fall apart the moment I asked the right questions. Mistakes always do. So later that morning, I drove into town and followed the address listed on the notice. The HOA office turned out to be a glass front building squeezed between a real estate brokerage and a nail salon. Fresh paint, polished floors, nothing on the walls older than 5 years. It felt less like a community space and more like a temporary command post. The man from my porch was already there. "Well," Vance said, standing up as soon as he saw me. "Mr. Carter, I figured you'd be coming by." I didn't sit down right away. "I need to understand how my uncle's ranch ended up under an HOA, I said, "because nothing about that land fits." Vance smiled and gestured to the chair anyway. Then he opened his binder. This time it had tabs, neatly labeled, color-coded, prepared in advance. According to our records, he said calmly, your uncle's property was included in the Spring Valley expansion plan several years ago. Expansion plan, I repeated. Approved by who? He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he slid a map across the desk. Clean lines, crisp borders, and right there, wrapped neatly inside them, was Carter's Edge. This reflects the current HOA jurisdiction, Vance said. I studied the map. The ink looked fresh. Too fresh. And when exactly was this approved? I asked. Vance leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. The HOA restructured its charter last year. With new zoning considerations, certain properties were reassessed. That's not how zoning works, I said. You don't just redraw lines around private land. He didn't argue. He just smiled again. These changes are pending final county review, he said. But while that process is underway, we're well within our rights to request compliance. Pending. That was the word. I was a science teacher. I spent my career explaining the difference between a hypothesis and a proven fact. You don't publish results based on data that's pending. You don't enforce conclusions that haven't been verified. And you sure as hell don't fine someone $120,000 based on a map that's still under review. Unless you're betting they're too scared to notice. I flipped through the binder myself. That's when I saw the list. Barn color restrictions, fence standards, livestock limitations. A note stating that pets needed to be indoors after 7 in the evening. I looked up at him. You're telling me I can't keep cattle near my own fence line? It's about community standards, Vance replied smoothly. What community? I asked. There isn't a house within sight of my property. That may change, he said. Development has a way of accelerating once the groundwork is laid. There it was. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about order or appearance. It was about control. About turning land into something manageable, something sellable. And if I don't comply, I asked. Vance didn't hesitate. Then the HOA will pursue all available remedies, he said. Liens, enforcement actions, asset recovery. I stood up. My uncle fought hard to keep that land independent, I said. If there's been a mistake, I'll prove it. Vance's smile never wavered. I'm sure you'll try, he said. But these situations rarely end well for people who resist. I walked out without shaking his hand. Back in my truck, I sat there for a moment before starting the engine. The town looked the same, people going about their day, cars passing, life uninterrupted. But I understood something now. This HOA wasn't confused. They weren't guessing. They were counting on fear, and fear only works if you don't stop to question the details. I didn't drive straight back to the ranch after leaving Vance's office. Instead, I headed a few blocks down Main Street and pulled into the gravel lot in front of the general store. It was the kind of place that had outlived trends, mayors, and more than a few bad ideas. Weathered wood, a bell over the door, handwritten signs taped to the glass that hadn't changed in years. If there was one place where the truth still lived in this town, it was here. The bell rang as I stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver hair pulled neatly back and eyes that missed very little. She looked up, studied my face for a second, then nodded like she'd just solved a puzzle. You must be Mike's nephew, she said. I stopped mid-step. Yes, ma'am, I replied. Jack Carter. She smiled faintly. I'm Linda. Your uncle came in every Thursday morning. Same time, same order, black coffee, never sugar. That alone told me I was in the right place. I was hoping you could help me with something, I said. Spring Valley HOA. Her smile vanished. She let out a short, tired laugh and shook her head. So they finally came for you. The way she said it, finally, made my stomach tighten. They're saying my uncle's ranch falls under their jurisdiction, I said. 12 years of back dues. Linda leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even though there was no one else close enough to hear. Honey, she said, that land has been outside their boundaries since the day Spring Valley drew the line. Are you sure? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Absolutely. She reached down beneath the counter, not into a drawer, but into a small wooden crate tucked beside her feet. From it, she pulled out a dented old cigar box, the kind men use to keep nails, photos, and important scraps of life in. Linda opened it and thumbed through a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. These towns remember things, she said quietly, even when people pretend they don't. She stopped on one clipping and slid it across the counter toward me. The headline was faded but still readable. Rancher defeats HOA in landmark. Ruling the date at the top stopped my breath. 10 years ago. Your uncle didn't just say no, Linda said, tapping the paper with one finger. He humiliated them. I scanned the article. It talked about boundary disputes, about an HOA attempting to annex unplatted land, about a judge ruling that Carter's Edge was not part of Spring Valley and never had been. He fought them in court, I said quietly. And he won, Linda replied. Clean and clear. My hands curled slightly around the edge of the paper. Then why would they try this again? I asked. Linda leaned back, folding her arms. Because the man who knew how to stop them isn't here anymore. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Sterling Vance, she continued. He's been itching to expand those borders for years. Ever since developers started waving money around, golf courses, townhomes, luxury estates, your uncle's land was always the one piece he couldn't touch. So they waited, I said. She nodded. They waited until Mike was gone, and until someone new showed up who didn't know the history. The words settled heavily between us. Did my uncle ever think they'd try again? I asked. Linda looked at me for a long moment. Once, she said. He told me, they'll come back when I'm dead. People like that always do. A chill ran through me. I folded the clipping carefully and slid it back across the counter. Linda put it back in the cigar box like it belonged there, part of the town's memory. You need to be careful, Jack, she said. These people don't like losing, and they don't like being reminded that they can. Outside, the sun was still high. Cars rolled past. Someone laughed across the street. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. This wasn't about unpaid dues. It wasn't about compliance. And it wasn't about community. It was about land. And they'd waited until the one man who could stop them was gone. As I climbed back into my truck, one question kept circling in my mind. If my uncle had already beaten them once, why were they acting like they'd never lost? The answer was unsettlingly simple. They thought I didn't know the rules, and they were about to find out how wrong they were. I drove back to the ranch with the windows down, letting the dry mountain air clear my head. Linda's words echoed louder than the engine. They waited until Mike was gone. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already drifting lower in the sky, painting long shadows across the pasture. The land looked the same as it always had, open, quiet, unbothered by paperwork and politics. But I knew better now. Inside the house, I spread everything out on the kitchen table. The HOA notice, Vance's map, the newspaper clipping Linda had shown me, and from a metal filing cabinet my uncle kept in the study. A stack of older documents I hadn't fully examined yet. Deeds, tax records, survey plats. If Vance was telling the truth, the story would line up. If he wasn't, the math would fail. I started with the maps. My uncle's originals were thick, yellowed, and precise. Bearings, distances. Surveyor stamps pressed deep enough into the paper that you could feel them with your fingers. These weren't guesses. They were measurements taken by people who understood that land doesn't care what you want it to be. Then I laid Vance's map beside them. At first glance it looked official enough. Clean lines, sharp borders, a neat little label reading Spring Valley HOA boundary, revised. But the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. There were no survey pins marked, no bearings, no reference monuments, just smooth curves that wrapped around Carter's Edge like a net. I leaned back in my chair. In science, when something looks too clean, it usually is. I checked the date in the corner, 2 weeks. The map had been created less than 2 weeks before I moved onto the property. That alone was damning. No legitimate boundary change happens quietly. Not in 2 weeks. Not without notices, hearings, public records, and a paper trail thick enough to choke on. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the county's public GIS records. The internet connection out here was slow, but it worked well enough. Parcel boundaries loaded one by one. Carter's Edge sat exactly where my uncle's map said it always had, outside the HOA line. No revisions, no pending updates, no notes, nothing. I stared at the screen, then back at Vance's map. Pending. That word came back to me again. You don't enforce a conclusion that hasn't been proven. You don't collect fines on a theory, and you don't threaten to take someone's land based on paperwork that hasn't been approved. unless you're relying on intimidation instead of legality. I flipped Vance's map over. On the back, faint but visible, were pencil marks, eraser smudges, the ghost of an earlier line that didn't quite match the one printed on the front. Someone had drawn this. By hand. I felt a slow burn settle in my chest. Not panic, not fear, but clarity. This wasn't an expansion. It was a redraw, and redraws don't happen by accident. As the light faded outside, I heard a truck slow down near the front of the property. Gravel crunched, an engine idled. I stood up and stepped onto the porch. Two men were standing near the edge of my driveway, unloading something from the back of their truck. One of them glanced up at me, then quickly looked away. "What are you doing?" I called out. They froze, then one of them straightened. "HOA installation," he said. "We've got authorization." Authorization for what? I walked down the driveway, the evening air sharp in my lungs. By the time I reached them, the answer was already clear. A brand new sign lay face down in the dirt. "Welcome to Spring Valley Estates. A proud HOA community." My jaw tightened. "Who told you to put that here?" I asked. The man shrugged. "We got a permit from the HOA president. Said this road's part of the community now." I looked back toward my house, toward the land my uncle had protected for decades. That sign wasn't just a marker, it was a claim. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I just stood there long enough for the message to sink in, on both sides. "Pack it up," I said. "You're on private property." The men hesitated, exchanged a glance, then began loading the sign back into the truck. As they drove away, dust hung in the air longer than it should have. I walked back inside, closed the door, and returned to the table. The pieces were starting to fit. They weren't trying to convince me I belonged to the HOA. They were trying to make it look like I already did. And if they could get enough signs up, enough paperwork filed, enough fear stirred, the truth wouldn't matter anymore. I gathered the maps into a single stack and slid them into my uncle's old leather folder. Tomorrow, I would find someone who knew how to read these lines better than anyone else. Someone who understood that land tells the truth, even when people don't. Because whatever Sterling Vance thought he was doing, he'd just made his first real mistake. And I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. I didn't sleep much that night either. Not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. The pieces were lining up too cleanly now, too deliberately. Once you see a pattern, it's hard to unsee it. Just after sunrise, I stepped outside and walked down the driveway to where the men had tried to plant that sign. The tire tracks were still there, pressed into the dirt like footprints that refused to fade. Paper had turned into action. That's when I noticed something else. At the edge of the road, near the wooden arch my uncle had built years ago, a new marker had appeared overnight. Small, plastic, bright orange, survey flags. They fluttered lightly in the morning breeze, staked into the ground as if they'd always belonged there. They hadn't. I stood there for a long moment, hands on my hips, listening to the quiet, no engines, no voices. Just the sound of wind through grass and a creek running somewhere beyond the trees. This wasn't a mistake. Survey flags don't appear unless someone plans to change something. Later that afternoon, another vehicle pulled onto the property. This one didn't hesitate. A white SUV with tinted windows rolled straight past the arch and onto the dirt road, like it had every right to be there. I stepped into the driveway and raised a hand. The SUV stopped. Two people got out, both wearing dark jackets with small HOA logos stitched near the chest, clipboards, cameras, calm expressions that didn't match the situation. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man in front adjusted his glasses. "We're documenting non-compliance," he said. "This property is under review." "Under review," I repeated. "That doesn't give you permission to be here." "We're operating under HOA authority," he replied, already lifting his camera. "This will only take a moment." That was when the irritation hardened into something else. "You're trespassing," I said. "I'm asking you to leave." They didn't. Instead, the woman beside him pointed toward the barn. "That structure appears to be in violation of community safety standards." Community safety. The words tasted wrong. "That barn's been standing longer than you've been alive," I said, "and you don't represent any community I agreed to join." The man lowered his camera slightly, just enough to look at me over the lens. "Sir, you can dispute jurisdiction through the proper channels, but right now, We're just doing our job. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Perfect, I said. I'm glad we're documenting this together. They exchanged a glance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step closer. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch. Silence makes people uncomfortable when they're not used to resistance. After a few seconds, the man cleared his throat. "We'll note your objection," he said. "But this process is moving forward." "Not on my land," I replied. They got back into the SUV and drove off slowly, dust curling behind them like a warning. That night, the ranch felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt tense, like the land itself was waiting. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder of maps open in front of me. Outside, the moonlight washed over the pasture, silver and calm, as if nothing was wrong. Around midnight, headlights flashed briefly near the barn. I stood up slowly and stepped onto the porch. By the time I reached the yard, the lights were gone, but something else had been left behind. A laminated notice stapled to one of the fence posts. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure under HOA review. No signature, no county seal. Just a logo and a threat. I tore it down and folded it carefully, slipping it into my pocket. Evidence. That was when I finally admitted what I'd been avoiding all day. Sterling Vance wasn't bluffing, he wasn't confused, and he wasn't waiting for approval. He was testing boundaries, mine, and the laws. Back inside, I sat at my uncle's old desk and opened the leather folder again. Maps, deeds, notes scribbled in margins that only made sense if you knew the land as well as he had. Tomorrow, I would drive into the city and put this in front of someone who understood exactly how dangerous this kind of overreach could become. Because once an HOA starts walking onto land it doesn't own, paper stops being paper, and the next move is never accidental. I turned off the light and stared out into the darkness, listening to the quiet settle again. Whatever this was turning into, I knew one thing for certain. Sterling Vance had crossed from intimidation into trespass, and there was no going back now. By morning, my decision was already made. Sterling Vance wasn't just pushing paperwork anymore. He was putting people on my land, hanging signs he had no right to hang, and daring me to react before I fully understood what he was doing. I couldn't fight that from my kitchen table. I packed my uncle's leather folder into the truck and headed toward the city. The drive down the mountain was quiet, giving me time to think. My uncle had always believed that boundaries mattered, not because they kept people out, but because they told the truth. Lines drawn honestly didn't move just because someone wanted them to. That was why my first stop was Everett. His office sat behind a row of older buildings, modest and unassuming. The sign out front read, "Everett Surveying," faded but still legible. Inside, the air smelled like cedar, ink, and time. Rolled maps leaned against the walls. Others were spread across a long wooden table, held down by coffee mugs and paperweights like they were still being debated. Everett stood behind the table, suspenders over his shoulders, studying a map with a magnifying glass. He looked up the moment I stepped inside. "You're Mike Carter's nephew," he said. "Yes, sir, Jack." He nodded slowly. "I figured they'd come after you next." That stopped me cold. He unrolled a set of plats without another word. Thick paper, deep survey stamps, handwritten notes in the margins. "I drew these myself," he said. "Original boundaries." At the corner of one page was a note written in careful script. "Parcel excluded per original HOA charter." "Spring Valley tried to pull that land in years ago," Everett said. "Your uncle refused, took them to court when they wouldn't back off. Judge ruled in his favor." "So they lost," I said. Everett let out a short breath. "Lost hard, and they've been pretending it never happened ever since." I told him everything. The binder, the map Vance showed me, the flags, the sign, the notice stapled to my fence. Everett listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once. "They're abusing the word pending," he said, "hoping you don't know the difference between a review and a ruling." "Can you help me prove it?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "I'll sign an affidavit," he said, "swearing these are the original boundaries and that Carter's Edge was never part of that HOA." Relief hit me like a deep breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He was halfway through signing when he paused and glanced toward the front window. I followed his gaze. Across the street, a dark SUV sat parked at the curb. Two people stood beside it, not approaching, not knocking, just standing there, clipboards in hand. One of them lifted a camera and took a photo of Everett's building, then of my truck, then of me through the glass. They didn't come inside, Everett said quietly. Smart. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Linda. Jack, there's an HOA SUV parked down the block. They've been asking around. The people outside didn't look threatening. That was the point. They weren't yelling, weren't confronting anyone. They were documenting, watching. I felt a slow chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't enforcement. It was surveillance. They want you to know you're being tracked, Everett said, that every move you make is being logged. The man with the camera lowered it just long enough to make eye contact with me. Then he looked back at his clipboard and wrote something down. Everett slid the affidavit across the table. Take this to your lawyer, he said, and to the county, and don't give them a reason to twist anything. I folded the document carefully and slipped it into the folder. As I walked out, the two people by the SUV didn't move. They didn't block me, didn't speak. They just watched as I got into my truck and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw them writing again. That's when it hit me. They weren't trying to stop me. They were counting on me leaving, because whatever Sterling Vance was planning next, he didn't want me anywhere near the ranch when it happened. And for the first time since this started, I felt something colder than anger. I felt hunted. I didn't go straight back to the ranch after leaving Everett's office. I couldn't. The affidavit was warm in my pocket, like proof that still hadn't decided whether it would save me or arrive too late. I drove instead to meet with a property attorney in the city, someone Everett trusted, someone who knew how these things actually played out once papers started turning into pressure. By the time we finished going over the documents, the light outside his office windows had shifted, afternoon sliding toward evening, time moving the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. I remember checking my phone before I left. No missed calls, no messages. That should have comforted me. It didn't. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than usual. The road twisted through familiar curves, but something in my chest tightened with every mile. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd done the right thing by not confronting Vance again without legal backing. That restraint would matter later. When I finally turned onto my driveway, the first thing I noticed was the dust. It hung in the air, thicker than it should have been, catching the late sunlight in a way that made the whole scene feel hazy, unreal. Then I saw the tracks, deep, wide, fresh. Bulldozer tracks. My heart dropped into my stomach. I hit the brakes and jumped out of the truck before the engine had even stopped, running the rest of the way on foot. The barn was still standing, but not the way it had been that morning. One entire side had been torn open, wood splintered and crushed inward, like it had been hit by a slow, unstoppable force. The roof sagged at an angle that made my knees weaken just looking at it. Broken beams lay scattered across the ground, half buried in churned-up dirt. For a second, I couldn't breathe. That barn wasn't just a building. My uncle had built it himself, board by board. I could still picture him standing in the doorway years ago, wiping sweat from his brow, telling me where not to step so I wouldn't fall through the loft. Now it looked like something had taken a bite out of it and decided it wasn't finished yet. A man in a reflective vest noticed me and raised a hand. "Sir," he called out, "you need to stay back." "Who told you to do this?" I shouted, my voice sounding far away even to my own ears. He hesitated, then pointed toward a pickup truck parked nearby. A clipboard sat on its hood, papers clipped neatly in place. "We're here under an emergency abatement order," he said. "Safety hazard." I walked closer, ignoring him. Stapled to what was left of the barn's front post was a bright red notice. Unsafe structure. Emergency code. Violation. No county seal. No inspector's name. Just the Spring Valley HOA logo at the bottom. They had slapped a generic safety hazard sticker on a barn that had stood for 50 years. It wasn't about safety. It was demolition by bureaucracy. "This structure posed an immediate risk," the man continued, clearly reading from a script now. "We were authorized to mitigate the hazard." "By who?" I demanded. He shifted uncomfortably. "The HOA." That was it. They hadn't waited for a court order. They hadn't waited for approval. They'd waited for me to leave. I stepped back and looked at the land around me. Survey flags still fluttered near the driveway. The HOA sign they had tried to install was gone, but its absence felt intentional now, like they didn't need it anymore. They weren't claiming the land, they were erasing it. I dropped to one knee and picked up a broken plank from the ground. It was heavy, rough, familiar. My uncle's work. I ran my thumb along a nail he'd driven decades earlier. They didn't just destroy a building, I thought. They destroyed proof. Proof that the land had been used, maintained, cared for. Proof that this wasn't some abandoned structure they could label a hazard and sweep away. Behind me, an engine shut off. A man climbed down from a bulldozer, his face pale. "I swear," he said quickly. "I thought this was legit. They showed me paperwork, said it was an emergency." I looked at him. He wasn't lying. He was just another tool being used. "Who signed it?" I asked. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. HOA letterhead, a signature at the bottom. Sterling Vance. The name burned. I took the paper and folded it carefully, the way you handle something fragile, not because it is, but because what it represents matters. The crew finished what they'd been ordered to do and left. No apologies, no explanations. Just engine starting and dust settling again, like nothing had happened. The ranch was quiet. Too quiet. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, staring out at the silhouette of the damaged barn against the darkening sky. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. My phone buzzed. A message from Linda. "Jack." I just heard about the barn, so they weren't even hiding it. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. It wasn't even a legal gray area. They had crossed a line on purpose, knowing the damage would be done before anyone could stop them. And they had done it while I was gone. That was the part that hurt the most. Not just the loss, but the timing. They'd waited until I trusted the process, until I believed reason and paperwork might still matter. I stood up and walked outside one last time before bed. The stars were out, sharp and clear, the same ones my uncle used to point at when he talked about how small people really are compared to land and time. I understood him better now. Sterling Vance hadn't just made a move, he'd declared war, and from that moment on, there was no version of this story where I backed down. Not after what they'd done, not after what they'd taken. Whatever came next, it would not be quiet, and it would not be handled on their terms anymore. The morning after the barn was torn open, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The ranch was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after something violent has already happened. No engines, no voices, just the wind and the sound of loose boards tapping against each other where the barn used to stand solid. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the damage, replaying every decision I'd made over the last few days. I told myself I'd done the right thing by leaving to get legal help. I told myself this wasn't my fault. But anger has a way of ignoring logic. By mid-morning, the first certified letter arrived. I recognized the envelope immediately. Official, heavy paper, the kind designed to intimidate before you even open it. Final notice of non-compliance. They were moving fast now. The letter accused me of multiple violations, unauthorized structures, failure to adhere to community standards, obstruction of emergency remediation efforts. Each accusation was stacked neatly, like bricks, building toward a conclusion they wanted to force. At the bottom was the same threat, reworded. Failure to comply may result in additional enforcement actions. I didn't have to wonder what that meant. An hour later, I found out. I was in the kitchen, on the phone with the attorney I'd met the day before, when I heard the sound of a diesel engine slowing outside, not passing by, turning in. I stepped onto the porch just as a tow truck rolled into my driveway. Behind it, a county-licensed vehicle idled, lights not flashing, but present enough to make the point. A man climbed out of the tow truck and looked at a clipboard. "You the owner of the black pickup?" he asked. "That's my truck," I said. "What's going on?" He shifted uncomfortably. "We've got an order to tow it." "On what grounds?" "HOA complaint," he replied. "Commercial vehicle parked in violation of community rules." I stared at him. "This isn't a commercial vehicle, and this isn't an HOA community." He shrugged. "I don't decide that. I just execute the order." I turned to the county driver. "You know this land isn't under HOA jurisdiction." He avoided my eyes. "There's a pending review on the parcel," he said quietly. "Until it's resolved, we're required to enforce the notice." Pending. There it was again. They knew they couldn't win in court yet, so they were making sure I couldn't afford to get there. I watched as the tow operator hooked the chain to my truck. The sound of metal tightening felt louder than it should have. "That truck is how I get to town," I said. "How I haul supplies, how I work." The county driver sighed. "You can contest it. There's a process." There was always a process. The truck was lifted, hauled away, and just like that, another piece of my independence disappeared down the road. Inside the house, my phone buzzed non-stop. Another letter, another email, another notice. One accused me of unauthorized wildlife management because deer had been seen grazing near my fence line. Another cited me for failing to install HOA approved fencing. One even mentioned a violation regarding pets, my dog not wearing an approved community collar. It was absurd, and that was the point. This wasn't enforcement, it was attrition. By the end of the day, my bank app wouldn't load. I called the number on the screen and waited through 3 rounds of hold music before a calm voice explained that my account had been temporarily restricted due to a legal notice associated with a lien claim. A lien, based on a map that was still pending. I hung up and sat there in silence, the weight of it finally settling in. No truck, no access to funds, legal bills stacking up. They weren't trying to prove they were right. They were trying to exhaust me. As the sun dipped low, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. An old pickup rattled to a stop near the porch. Rusted fender, cracked windshield. The kind of truck that had earned every mile. The driver stepped out. It was Tom, my uncle's neighbor from the far side of the ridge. Retired sheriff. Quiet man. Hadn't said much since I arrived, but he'd been watching. "Get in," he said simply. I hesitated. "My truck." "Already heard," he replied. "I'm driving." The relief that hit me then surprised me. On the drive into town, I told him everything. The barn, the letters, the tow, the frozen account. Tom listened, hands steady on the wheel. "They always do this part," he said finally. "Paper cuts, hoping you bleed out before anyone notices." "What do I do?" I asked. He glanced at me. "You get louder, and you get smarter." The attorney met us that evening. He didn't flinch when I explained my situation, didn't ask for a retainer. "I'll take this on contingency," he said. "If we win, I get paid, and it won't be from you." "Why?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "Because your evidence is clean, and because HOAs hate daylight." As Tom drove me back to the ranch that night, the road felt different. I was still boxed in, still under pressure, but I wasn't alone anymore. Sterling Vance had tried to starve me out. Instead, he'd done something far worse. He'd given me witnesses. And the next move wouldn't be quiet, not after this. The courthouse didn't look dramatic from the outside. Gray stone, wide steps, flags barely moving in the morning air. It was the kind of building designed to calm people down, not excite them. A place where voices were meant to lower themselves automatically. That suited me just fine. Tom dropped me off at the curb and gave me a single nod before driving away. No speeches, no advice. He'd already done his part, getting me here when the system had tried to keep me away. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Shoes echoed. Conversations were hushed. Everyone looked like they were carrying something heavier than they wanted to admit. Sterling Vance was already there. He stood near the courtroom doors, khakis pressed, blazer sharp, binder tucked under his arm like an extension of his body. When he saw me, he smiled, confident, polite, practiced, as if the barn had never been touched, as if my truck wasn't sitting in an impound lot, as if none of this was personal. My attorney arrived moments later, calm as ever, briefcase in hand. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since they tore down the barn," I said. He nodded. "Good, then let's keep this simple." Inside the courtroom, the judge took her seat and called the case. The HOA's attorney went first. Long sentences, smooth delivery, lots of words that sounded official without saying much at all. He talked about community standards, about safety concerns, about pending jurisdictional reviews, and the HOA's responsibility to act proactively. Proactively. My attorney didn't interrupt. He just listened, hands folded, letting the rope play out. When it was our turn, he stood and approached the bench with a thin stack of documents. "Your Honor," he said, "this case hinges on one claim, that my client's property falls under the authority of the Spring Valley HOA. He paused. It does not. He laid the first document on the table. Exhibit A, the original court ruling from 10 years ago. Carter's Edge explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction. The judge reviewed it, nodded, and set it aside. Exhibit B, an affidavit from Everett, the licensed surveyor who drew the original boundaries. He handed it up. And Exhibit C, he said, the HOA's own map. That got a reaction. The judge studied the map carefully, then looked up. This document is marked as pending. Yes, Your Honor, my attorney replied. And yet the HOA used it to justify fines, demolition, and enforcement actions totaling over $100,000. Sterling Vance shifted in his seat. My attorney continued. Which brings us to the smoking gun. He turned to me briefly, then back to the bench. The HOA claims Mr. Carter's uncle voluntarily joined the association years ago, making his property subject to dues and enforcement. He held up a single page. This is the alleged agreement. The judge leaned forward. The signature on this document is dated March 12th, my attorney said evenly. On that date, Mr. Carter's uncle was in the ICU. The room went still. He suffered a major cardiac event and was hospitalized for 6 days. We have medical records, doctor statements, hospital logs. My attorney looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, on March 12th, Mike Carter couldn't lift a spoon. A murmur rippled through the gallery. He could not sign a contract, my attorney continued, and yet the HOA presents this document as proof of consent. Sterling Vance stood abruptly. Objection. Sit down, the judge said, without raising her voice. My attorney wasn't finished. We also submit phone records showing Mr. Vance accessed the HOA document system less than 48 hours before this agreement appeared. Metadata confirms the file was modified. Forgery. The word didn't need to be spoken. The judge removed her glasses and looked directly at Sterling Vance. Mr. Vance, she said, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Vance opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. We acted in good faith based on information available to us at the time. The judge's expression didn't change. Good faith does not include demolishing private property under a pending map, she said, nor does it include submitting documents that appear to be falsified. She turned back to the clerk. The lien is dismissed. The tow order is void. The HOA is barred from further enforcement actions against Carter's Edge, effective immediately. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in days. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, this court is referring the matter to the county attorney for investigation into potential fraud and abuse of authority. Sterling Vance looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. My attorney placed a hand on my shoulder. Outside, the sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. Reporters were already gathering, cameras, microphones, questions being asked louder than they needed to be. I didn't say much. I didn't have to, because the truth had finally caught up with the paperwork. Sterling Vance walked past me without making eye contact. For the first time since this began, he looked small, and as Tom picked me up to drive back to the ranch, I realized something important. They hadn't just lost in court, they'd lost control of the narrative. And once that happens, everything else starts to fall apart. The fight wasn't over yet, but the lie was. I thought the hardest part would be over once the judge ruled. I was wrong. Winning in court stops the bleeding. But it's what happens after the doors open that decides who really walks away clean. By the time Tom and I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, the sidewalk had turned into a narrow corridor of microphones and cameras. Local news at first, then regional. A few faces I didn't recognize, holding phones instead of press badges. Someone shouted my name. Another voice asked about the barn. Another asked about the forged documents. I raised a hand, not to speak, but to pause them. I'm not here to perform, I said calmly. I'm here because someone tried to take land that didn't belong to them. That line made the evening news. The next morning, it was everywhere. HOA president accused of fraud. In land grab scheme. Rancher's barn demolished under pending map. The story spread faster than I expected. Not because of me, but because people recognized the pattern. Emails started coming in by the dozens, then hundreds. Homeowners from other counties, other states, all saying the same thing in different words. They tried this with us too. We thought we were alone. We didn't know we could fight back. That's when the real damage began. Not to me, but to them. By midweek, Spring Valley HOA's board announced an emergency meeting. Not a public one. Just board members, just lawyers. It didn't matter. Someone leaked the minutes, arguments, accusations, finger-pointing. Vance insisting everything had been misinterpreted. Others asking why his signature kept appearing on documents no one else remembered approving. By Friday, 3 board members resigned. By Monday, the county attorney's office announced a formal investigation into zoning manipulation, document falsification, and abuse of emergency enforcement powers. Developers quietly pulled out. The glossy brochures vanished from websites overnight. Spring Valley Estates, Phase 3, was suddenly under review. Pending. I almost smiled at that. Back at the ranch, the tow company called to schedule the return of my truck. The bank unfroze my account without ceremony, no apology. Just a quiet correction, like it had never happened. The barn would take longer. Neighbors showed up without asking. Some brought tools, some brought lumber. Linda drove up in her station wagon, unloading trays of sandwiches and coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way my uncle liked it. One neighbor brought an old sign he'd saved from my uncle's place years ago, found in the back of his shed. Carter's Edge, EST, 1984. We leaned it carefully against what remained of the barn wall. Sterling Vance never came back to the ranch. The last time I saw him was on the news, walking into a county building, head down, no binder in sight. The confident smile was gone, replaced by the stiff posture of a man realizing paper doesn't protect you when the truth starts circulating. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Because the land was quiet again. Not the tense quiet of waiting, but the honest kind. The kind my uncle used to talk about. The kind that comes after something false has been stripped away. That night, I sat on the porch with my dog at my feet, looking out over the pasture where the sun dipped low and painted the hills gold. The fight had taken something from me, but it had given something back too. Clarity. And the understanding that power only works when people believe they're alone. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither was anyone else who heard this story and realized they didn't have to be afraid of a binder and a bill. Not if the land is truly theirs. The ranch didn't look the same after that. Not because it was damaged, land heals, but because I saw it differently now. Where I once saw quiet, I now saw resilience. Where I once thought ownership was just paperwork, I understood it was something deeper, something older, something that doesn't show up on glossy maps or HOA letterhead. It shows up in calloused hands, in fence posts set straight, in buildings that stand for 50 years without asking permission from anyone. The barn took months to rebuild. Longer than I wanted, shorter than I feared. Neighbors came and went, some stayed all day, some just dropped off lumber or tools and left without saying much. No one asked for credit, no one talked about court or headlines. They talked about weather, cattle prices, and how my uncle used to wave from the porch when trucks passed by. That's how life is supposed to feel. One afternoon, while we were setting the last beams in place, I found one of my uncle's old notes tucked inside the leather folder I'd carried through courtrooms and meetings. It was written in his handwriting, uneven, practical. If you're reading this, it means they finally tried again. I sat there for a long time, holding that scrap of paper. He had known. He had prepared. And in his own quiet way, he had trusted me to finish what he started. The HOA never came back. Spring Valley quietly revised its boundaries to match the original ruling. No press release, no apology. Just a correction buried in paperwork where they hoped no one would notice. People noticed, because once a lie collapses, it leaves fingerprints everywhere. Sometimes I think about Sterling Vance, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just curiosity. I wonder if he believed what he was doing was justified, or if he'd simply gotten used to no one pushing back. Power has a way of dulling your sense of consequence. The land doesn't have that problem. It remembers everything. It remembers who cared for it and who tried to take shortcuts. It remembers which structures were built with patience and which ones were forced through with paperwork and threats. And it outlasts all of them. On quiet evenings now, I sit on the porch where this all started. Same view, same wind, same stars. The only difference is the understanding that came with the fight. I didn't win because I was stronger. I won because I paid attention, because I asked questions, because I didn't panic when someone tried to rush me into compliance, and because I wasn't afraid to let the truth take its time. If there's one thing this land taught me, it's this. Anyone can wave a binder and demand obedience. But ownership doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from history, from stewardship, from standing your ground when it would be easier to walk away. So, if someone ever shows up at your door with a number you don't recognize and a threat you didn't earn, remember this story. Read the fine print. Ask who benefits, and don't confuse confidence with authority, because sometimes the quietest piece of land in the room is the one that tells the loudest truth. And if you listen closely enough, it will tell you one thing clearly. They didn't just pick the wrong ranch, they picked the wrong owner.